Sophia. Sophia's mother was a prostitute in Mexico. Sophia's father was and still is right here in the state of Indiana. When Sophia was 10 years old, she was coerced into adoption by her father. The same father, by the way, who then proceeded to raise her as a prostitute. Sophia's father was also the member of a gang that directly facilitated the trafficking of his own daughter. In addition to being raised as a prostitute in her own house, Sophia was also forced to live for days at a time in a storage shed where adult men had unlimited access to her. Sometimes Sophia's services were exchanged for motorcycle parts. After years of daily chronic sexual abuse, Sophia was finally impregnated by her own father by the age of 13. The same father, by the way, who then proceeded to violently abort the baby himself. To this day, Sophia's father is a free man here in the state of Indiana. He was never charged, and he was never prosecuted for his actions. But my question for us here today is, did all of these events which transpired in Sophia's childhood affect the way in which her brain developed? The answer is absolutely. How so? Well, in this talk, I would like to briefly introduce 5 basic themes of brain development. The first theme is that the brain develops in a very specific order. The second theme is that each stage of brain development affects the next stage. The third theme is that the brain also processes all incoming information in the same exact order as the brain originally developed. The fourth theme is that the brain tends to focus more on unfinished business than finished business. But the fifth theme, thank God, is that the brain is not set in stone. So how does all of this apply to Sophia? Well, let's start off talking about the order in which the brain develops. The first part of the brain to develop is the survival brain. The second part is the emotion brain, followed by the attachment brain, and then finally, the cognition brain. So let's take a look at each of these 4 stages of brain development in a little more detail. So as I mentioned, the first part of the brain to develop is a survival brain. So this is the part of the brain that drives everything we do automatically, such as circulation, digestion, respiration, including our 3-pronged response to danger or crisis, which we all know to be fight, flight, and freeze. Now, in the case of non-traumatized children who, by definition, are rarely exposed to danger or crisis, they have the luxury of developing relatively stable or contained survival brains. However, even when their survival brains are triggered, they still have the additional luxury of a nurturing caregiver that can help them co-regulate that survival brain until it returns to a more calm and stable baseline. But that is not how Sophia's brain developed. Since Sophia was constantly exposed to danger and crisis, her survival brain never got a break. Since her survival brain was overworked, it also overdeveloped, including and especially fight, flight, and freeze, which, as we will see, will have a ripple effect on the rest of her brain development. Because the next part of the brain to develop is the emotion brain. So this is the part of the brain that interprets messages from the survival brain and then communicates that information to the rest of the brain. Now, in the case of non-traumatized children, who, as you recall, have the luxury of a relatively stable survival brain, well, it's precisely that stability which then allows them the opportunity to develop a full spectrum of both positive and negative emotions, all of which they will need later on in life. But that is not how Sophia's brain developed. Since Sophia did not have a stable survival brain, she actually learned that she didn't have a huge need for positive emotions. Why not? Because you don't need positive emotions in order to execute fight, flight, and freeze. In fact, if anything, Sophia learned that positive emotions were bad. For example, if I love daddy, but then daddy treats me in these horrific ways, then maybe it's not such a good idea to love someone. However, Sophia did need plenty of negative emotions in order to survive her childhood, but especially 2 in particular, fear and anger. Why is that? Because you do need fear and anger in order to execute fight, flight, and freeze, which once again will have a ripple effect on the rest of her brain development, because the next part of the brain to develop is the attachment brain. So this is the part of the brain that learns to bond, connect, and relate to other people. But how in the world do you bond with a father that rapes you? Or how do you connect with a father that impregnates you? Or how do you relate to a father that then kills the baby that's inside of you? So not surprisingly, Sophia's attachment brain underdeveloped. Now, in the case of non-traumatized children, who, as you recall, have the full spectrum of both positive and negative emotions to work with, well, they have the emotional tools they need to learn to bond and connect with other people, and therefore find security and satisfaction in relationships. But once again, that is not how Sophia's brain developed. Since Sophia only had fear and anger to work with as her main emotions, she simply did not have the emotional tools she needed to bond and connect with other people. And therefore, Sophia learned to develop two opposing tendencies. On one hand, in order to overcompensate for that underdeveloped attachment brain, Sophia learned to over-rely on other people. In other words, become too needy and too clingy and too dependent. But then on the other hand, Sophia also learned to become belligerent and hostile, and sometimes even burn bridges that she could not always afford to burn. Why is that? That's because fight and flight from the survival brain was triggering fear and anger in the emotion brain, all of which is now spilling out onto the attachment brain, which, once again, will have a ripple effect on the rest of her brain development, because the next and final part of the brain to develop is the cognition brain. So this is the part of the brain which, based on all previous life experiences, learns to form beliefs about the self and others in the world. This is also the part of the brain that learns to make decisions based on factors such as pros and cons, cause and effect, short-term versus long-term. Now, in the case of non-traumatized children, based on their life experiences, they learn to develop relatively positive, or at the very least, balanced views of themselves and others in the world, in conjunction with balanced decision-making. In other words, decision-making that factors in both present and future consequences. But that is not how Sophia's brain developed. Based on her life experiences, Sophia learned to despise herself. She learned to distrust others. She learned to disdain a world that could have allowed these atrocities to happen in the first place, not to mention a world that did not and has not held her father accountable. In addition, Sophia also learned to develop a really impulsive and reactive decision-making style. Why is that? Because that is precisely the sort of decision-making she needed in order to survive her childhood. Sophia simply didn't have the luxury to sit around and ponder a future that might end today. So not surprisingly, what we see in traumatized children is that negative beliefs tend to overdevelop while decision-making underdevelops. So let's summarize a few of the key points we have made so far today. So far in this talk, we have seen that in traumatized children, the survival brain overdevelops, and especially fight, flight, and freeze, which in turn causes positive emotions to underdevelop, while negative emotions overdevelop, and especially fear and anger, which in turn causes the attachment brain to underdevelop, which in turn causes negative beliefs about the self, others, and the world to overdevelop, while decision-making underdevelops. And just in case you don't believe this brain stuff, let's take a look at a scan of two different brains. On the left, you see a healthy brain. On the right, you see an abused brain. Red indicates increased neurological activity. Black indicates almost no activity at all. What do you notice about the back of the abused brain? You see all that red? That's the part of the brain that drives survival functions, such as fight, flight, and freeze. So you see all the black in the abused brain. That's the part of the brain that is supposed to be regulating emotions. What do you notice about the front of the abused brain compared to the healthy brain? You see all the red that's missing? That's the part of the brain that's supposed to be making decisions. Do not tell me that chronic abuse and neglect does not affect the way in which our brain develops. But the tragedy of a traumatized brain doesn't even end there, because not only does the brain develop in a very specific order, but the brain also processes all incoming information in that same exact order. So what does that mean for Sophia? What does that mean when Sophia is presented with neutral, or let's even say positive information? What do you think happens to that information by the time it filters through fight, flight, and freeze, followed by fear and anger, followed by negative beliefs about self, others, and the world? Is that information still so neutral or positive anymore? No, it is not. That information is now skewed or distorted. And that's one of the reasons why Sophia to this day is so easily triggered by events which other people would not consider to be triggering. So what do you think happens when Sophia is presented with negative information? Well, to be honest, sometimes negative information doesn't even make it out of the survival brain. Why is that? That's because when Sophia was a child, she could not fight back, and she could not escape the torture she was experiencing. In fact, if she tried to escape or fight back, it only would have gotten worse. So that's why Sophia learned to freeze and then escape in her own mind. That's a process we refer to as dissociation. Sometimes to this day, when Sophia is sufficiently triggered, she will black out for hours at a time, have no recollection of what happened, sometimes even end up in strange places and have no clue how she got there. Now, another theme of brain development that I'd like to introduce here is what psychologists refer to as the Zeigarnik effect. Now, my own paraphrase, the Zeigarnik effect basically means that the brain tends to focus more on unfinished business than finished business. So, for those of you that are college students, think of the last time you took a big exam. What did you agonize about the most? The 45 questions you nailed or the 5 that you weren't so sure about? Probably the 5 you weren't so sure about. Or think of the last time you fired off 5 urgent text messages. What did you obsess about the most? The 4 that were answered or the 1 that was not? Probably the 1 that was not. That's the Zeigarnik effect. So how does this apply to Sophia? Well, basically, sometimes in life, events happen that are so atrocious and so horrific that the brain simply cannot compute what happened. In other words, the brain cannot process the information. The brain cannot integrate the information. In short, the brain cannot close the loop. And when that happens, what does the brain focus more on? You got it, unfinished business. And that explains why to this day, Sophia sometimes has flashbacks and nightmares of events that happened 10 years ago. Now, if the best of brain science stopped here, I think I'd be the first to hang up my hat as a psychologist and turn over my license. But the good news is the brain is not set in stone. On the contrary, the brain has the capacity to learn, grow, and heal throughout the lifespan. Not surprisingly, different scientists have different terms for this phenomenon. Some scientists refer to the plasticity of the brain. Other scientists use the term malleability. My own personally favorite term of all is post-traumatic growth. Now, post-traumatic growth basically means that not only does the brain have the capacity to heal from trauma, but the brain even has the capacity to learn new insights as a result of the trauma that it could not have learned otherwise. Now, post-traumatic growth is not a guarantee, but it is possible when provided with the right conditions. So what does this mean for Sophia? That means there are treatments available nowadays that can help Sophia learn to stabilize that survival brain, balance the emotion brain, bolster that attachment brain, recalibrate the cognition brain, and even neutralize the Zeigarnik effect. In other words, help Sophia learn to close the loop so that she really can move on with the rest of her life. Tragically, however, the problem of human trafficking is not just a problem of neurons. It's also a problem of morons. For the sake of this talk, I would like to define a moron as anyone who sexually exploits someone else for either pleasure or profit. Now, so far in this talk, we have learned that psychologists and others are working really hard to help people fix their neurons. What about the morons? Can they be fixed? Now, if so far in this talk you've been sitting here thinking that Sophia's story is probably pretty extreme and maybe doesn't really reflect the rest of society, then I am tempted to forgive you. But I'm not. Instead, I'm going to educate you. Because the reality is, Sophia's story is not an isolated case. According to the University of Texas, there are 79,000 Sophias in the state of Texas alone. So that's 79,000 children, minors, who are currently being trafficked for their bodies right now as we speak in just 1 out of 50 states. Let's not kid ourselves. The problem of human trafficking is epidemic in this country. So some of you might also be sitting here thinking, well, thank God I'm not one of those morons because I would never prostitute out my daughter. Okay, but would you ever physically or emotionally, visually or virtually prostitute out someone else's daughter or son? My friend, it happens millions of times a day in this country on the internet alone. Let's not kid ourselves. Pornography is prostitution. Prostitution is human trafficking. So just how bad is this problem of virtual trafficking? Well, how about 75% of all internet searches? How about 35% of all internet downloads? How about 28,000 users per second? How about 2.5 billion emails per day? Still not convinced? In this country alone, a new pornographic video is produced every 39 seconds. Do not tell me that we don't have a problem in this country. So what do we do when there's a problem in our society? Well, we consult with our leaders, of course, right? That is precisely my second burden for us here today. Why is it that you and I both are bombarded with daily headlines indicating that the leaders of our country, including leaders of courts, leaders of cinema, leaders of commerce, leaders of mass communication, leaders of our churches, leaders of Capitol Hill, are sometimes our leaders in sexual abuse. I just don't get it. Something does not compute. In fact, I think I'm experiencing my own Zeigarnik effect right now as we speak. So in order to make this simple for my own simple brain, is it safe to say that we have some morons in leadership? In fact, I sincerely hope that every single person in this room is experiencing the Zeigarnik effect along with me, because we have some major unfinished business in this country. But lest we point too many fingers, let's not forget that among the greatest leaders of sexual abuse in this country are college campuses. I was a dorm director for 3 years. I know that statistic firsthand. So a final question I have for us today is, are we really a city on a hill, or are we a city on a pill? The pill of lust and greed with the lethal, toxic side effect of hypocrisy. Now that's a tough pill to swallow. But do you know what's even worse? That pill is starting to swallow us. So in conclusion, I don't care if you're a pastor, I don't care if you're a priest, I don't care if you're a captain, I don't care if you're a coach, I don't care if you're a Democrat, I don't care if you're a Republican, I don't care if you're a professor, and I certainly don't care if you're a president. Unless we are severely dyslexic as a nation, then no does not mean on. And no certainly does not mean more on. Unless, of course, we have correctly self-diagnosed. Thank you.